The morning fog hung low over London, a grey veil softened only by the muted sunlight struggling through smoke-streaked skies. The city, still marked by charred buildings and shattered windows from months of relentless bombing, seemed to hold its breath. The distant rumble of artillery and air raid sirens had faded in the wake of a new sound. Boots, thousands of them, striking the cobblestones in disciplined cadence. American troops, fresh from training camps in the United States, marched through the heart of the capital for the first time. Their green uniforms contrasted sharply against London's soot-stained streets, and their presence carried the weight of hope and apprehension alike. Thomas Beckett, a British intelligence officer, stood on a side street near Whitehall, notebook clutched in hand. He had seen armies before, but never this, soldiers so confident, so alien to the war that had scarred his homeland. His eyes tracked the sharp movements of officers issuing commands, young privates adjusting their helmets, and the careful synchronization of platoons that seemed almost mechanical. Each footfall was a drumbeat of an alliance that could tip the scales of a war weary of stalemates and attrition. From a balcony above, Winston Churchill observed the spectacle with his trademark cigar clenched between his teeth, eyes narrowing in calculation. He noted the determination in the Americans' stride and the disciplined precision of their formations. Publicly, he would hail them as saviors, but privately, he assessed, as always, the hidden variables. Their inexperience in European combat, the potential for friction with British command, and the psychological weight of expecting young men to confront a ruthless enemy far from home. Montgomery, nearby, adjusted his gloves and whispered tactical notes to a junior officer, already anticipating the coordination challenges these newcomers would present in North Africa. Every corner of London vibrated with anticipation and unease. Civilians leaned from windows, children pressed their faces against panes, and shopkeepers paused mid-sweep, captivated by the march. Yet among the cheering and waving flags, Beckett could feel the undercurrent of tension. Not all eyes were welcoming. Rumors of sabotage, mistrust, and the sheer magnitude of change lingered like shadows in the city's alleys. A sudden drumbeat of uncertainty rippled through the formations. An American officer hesitated, his order misheard, and for a brief instant, the illusion of perfect discipline faltered. Beckett's pulse quickened. Could these troops, unfamiliar with both terrain and tradition, rise to meet the expectations pressed upon them by leaders like Eisenhower and Churchill? In that heartbeat of hesitation, the stakes of the entire alliance were etched in concrete. Churchill's gaze hardened. A smirk ghosted across his lips, barely perceptible beneath his cigar. The public saw triumph and camaraderie, but the Prime Minister saw a test, a measuring of character, resilience, and the unspoken challenges of forging two nations into a single, coordinated force against the Axis juggernaut. Montgomery's gloved hand hovered over maps of North Africa in his mind, calculating how this new infusion of manpower might tip the balance against Rommel's advancing forces. Beckett's eyes met those of a young American private, who glanced nervously toward the cheering crowd. There was hope, yes, but also fear, and the unspoken question that hung over every street of London. Could these outsiders, no matter how eager, survive the fire that had already forged the city? Before we go deeper, make sure you subscribe. This story only gets darker from here. The parade continued, boots striking with relentless rhythm, yet beneath the surface, unseen threads of tension, doubt, and political calculation intertwined. London's streets were alive, but the real battle, trust, coordination, and survival, had only just begun. The war didn't wait for morning sunlight or the cheers of the streets. Beneath London's battered cityscape, in the labyrinthine cabinet war rooms, the air was thick with smoke, tension, and the low hum of urgency. Maps of North Africa, Europe, and the Atlantic covered the tables, dotted with pins, lines, and notes marking every known enemy position. The room smelled of ink, paper, and determination. Thomas Beckett moved quietly among the officers, his eyes scanning telegrams and handwritten reports. Every piece of information mattered. Every intercepted message, every rumor of Rommel's movements could shift the course of the war. Eisenhower, the American general freshly arrived, leaned over a map with Bradley, their brows furrowed in concentration. The two exchanged rapid assessments, their differences in style immediately noticeable. Where Bradley was meticulous, Eisenhower was decisive, almost impatient. Beckett felt the weight of watching these giants work, knowing that even the smallest miscalculation could cost thousands of lives. Churchill paced along the edge of the room, cigar smoldering, his gaze flicking between his officers. Every word he uttered carried authority, but his eyes betrayed the calculation beneath the surface. This wasn't just a room of strategy, it was a room of politics, pressure, and fragile trust. The Americans were allies, yes, but they were also outsiders. Could their approach fit seamlessly with British tactics, or would pride and habit create friction at the worst possible moment? Outside, London streets were still echoing with the sound of marching boots, but inside, a different rhythm played out, a rhythm of codes, maps, and whispered speculation. Beckett felt it in the pit of his stomach. The city's safety wasn't guaranteed by the parade. It was guaranteed by every decision being made here, in the shadowed silence, behind closed doors. A sudden telegram arrived, its content raising immediate alarms. Rommel's forces had shifted unexpectedly, threatening to cut off supply lines crucial to Montgomery's campaign in North Africa. The room tensed. Montgomery's eyes narrowed as he traced the paths on the map. Patton, just learning the European terrain, leaned in to offer insight, but a subtle hesitation suggested he wasn't fully certain of the intelligence's reliability. Beckett realized how delicate the balance was. A misstep in coordination, a misread order, or even a missed message could unravel weeks of planning. The pressure wasn't just military, it was human. Lives, courage, and trust all hung in the balance, and every officer in the room carried that weight silently. The Americans were here to fight, yes, but first, they had to survive the trial of strategy, diplomacy, and human judgment. And as Beckett watched Churchill make a quiet note on the corner of a map, he understood. The battle for London's soul, and for the success of the Allied alliance, was happening far from the streets, in rooms like this, where every decision echoed with consequence. Far from London, the desert sun beat down on endless dunes, where Rommel's Africa Corps moved with precision and deadly efficiency. Every report that arrived in the war rooms in London made Beckett's pulse quicken. Intelligence suggested Rommel was planning another bold maneuver, one that could cut off Montgomery's supply lines and throw the Allies into chaos. The North African front was a high-stakes chessboard, and every piece mattered. Beckett leaned over a map spread across the war room table, tracing the paths Rommel's tanks might take. Montgomery, calm but intense, gestured toward key positions. "We have to anticipate him," he said, voice steady. "He's clever, but not infallible." Eisenhower nodded, his jaw tight, already thinking about how to coordinate reinforcements from the Americans. Patton's eyes gleamed with the thrill of action. He was eager, but the desert was unfamiliar, and overconfidence could be fatal. The tension in the room was palpable. Every officer knew that one mistake could cost hundreds, maybe thousands of lives. Beckett felt the weight of it pressing on his shoulders. The young Americans, fresh from parades in London, were about to be tested in ways they hadn't imagined. Could they rise to meet Rommel's cunning tactics? Could they work seamlessly with seasoned British commanders who had already learned hard lessons in the desert? Suddenly, a new report arrived. Rommel had shifted his forces, moving tanks and infantry in a direction no one had expected. The supply lines that Montgomery had counted on were now in danger. The room erupted in urgent discussion. Maps were redrawn, orders were whispered, and Beckett scribbled every detail into his notebook. This wasn't just strategy, it was survival. Amid the tension, Beckett noticed a flicker of admiration in Montgomery's eyes as he glanced at the American officers. The raw energy, the fresh perspective, it could be an advantage if channeled correctly. But it could just as easily be a liability if miscommunication or hesitation occurred at the wrong moment. The stakes were high, the desert unforgiving, and the enemy relentless. In that moment, Beckett realized the truth. The war was not just about battles on sand or soil. It was about trust, timing, and human judgment. Every decision made in London, every calculation by Montgomery, Eisenhower, and Patton, would be tested against Rommel's brilliance on the open desert. And one misstep could unravel months of planning, sending shockwaves through the fragile alliance forming across continents. The streets of London had a heartbeat all their own. Children ran between crumbling buildings, waving small flags, their laughter cutting through the gray of wartime rubble. Shopkeepers paused mid-sweep, peering out at the American troops marching through their neighborhoods, boots striking the cobblestones with disciplined precision. For many, it was a sight of hope, proof that help had arrived. For others, it was unfamiliar, even unsettling. Thomas Beckett walked among the crowds, notebook tucked under his arm, eyes scanning both soldiers and civilians. He noticed the subtle tension, a shopkeeper's wary glance, a mother holding her child closer, whispers about whether these newcomers would understand London, its people, its dangers. The city had survived bombings, raids, and constant fear, and now it was adjusting to a new rhythm, one set by foreign soldiers. Montgomery, visiting the city streets briefly to observe morale, moved alongside Beckett. He nodded to civilians, offering reassuring gestures, his presence a quiet reminder that leadership extended beyond battlefields. Beckett watched as American officers tried to mirror him, offering smiles and handshakes, yet their awkwardness betrayed their inexperience in civilian diplomacy. The city was not a parade ground. It was a living, breathing testament to survival, and it tested everyone who stepped onto its streets. Tension flickered suddenly. A rumor of sabotage spread through the crowd like wildfire. Beckett's instincts sharpened. Could someone be trying to undermine the new alliance, or was it just fear whispering through the city's ruined streets? Every step, every glance carried weight. Civilians who had seen too much death were cautious about trusting outsiders, even those who came to fight for the same cause. Yet, among the unease, moments of humanity shone. A soldier helped an elderly woman across a street. Children cheered at the sight of unfamiliar uniforms. Beckett realized the march wasn't just about military presence. It was about connection, about showing that allies were more than just reinforcements. They were people who could share in the city's struggle, and maybe in its hope. Churchill, watching from afar, scribbled notes in his pocket. He observed not just the soldiers' discipline, but the delicate dance of trust forming between strangers. Every small interaction mattered. Every moment in the streets shaped the fragile alliance that could define the war. Beckett felt it too. London's survival didn't rest only on strategy and battle plans, but on the human bonds slowly forming under the shadow of conflict. And as the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the cobblestones, Beckett understood the truth. The streets of London were a battlefield of morale, trust, and perception. One wrong move, one misstep of diplomacy or patience, could tip the balance in a war that was as much about hearts and minds as it was about guns and tanks. Not all threats came from the battlefield. Sometimes, the most dangerous enemies hid in plain sight. In the quiet corners of London, behind locked doors and heavy curtains, whispers carried secrets that could unravel months of planning. Thomas Beckett felt the weight of this reality pressing down on him as he moved through the dimly lit hallways of the intelligence offices. Every envelope, every coded message could be a key or a trap. Churchill's presence loomed over the operations like a constant shadow. His sharp eyes missed nothing, and his mind never stopped calculating. But even he could not see everything. A mole, a traitor, someone feeding information to the enemy, could undo all that the Allies were trying to achieve. Beckett's heart raced as he sifted through intercepted communications, searching for patterns, anything that could expose the hidden danger. The Americans, still adjusting to London and its complex web of alliances, were unaware of the threat moving quietly around them. Eisenhower and Bradley discussed strategies for the North African campaign, confident in their numbers and training, while Beckett worried about what lay beneath the surface. One wrong move, one leak, could cost lives and tip the delicate balance of trust between the Allies. Suddenly, Beckett noticed a discrepancy in a series of reports. Orders had been altered, but only slightly, enough to create confusion in the field. His pulse quickened. Could this be the work of the mole? He traced the notes back through every office, every clerk, every courier, until the possibility became chillingly real. Someone within British intelligence was playing a dangerous game, and no one could be trusted entirely. Montgomery, sensing Beckett's tension, placed a steady hand on his shoulder. "Keep your focus," he said. "Information is power, but haste is dangerous. One wrong accusation can ruin everything." Beckett nodded, knowing that patience and precision were his only tools against an invisible enemy. The city outside moved on, unaware of the silent war unfolding within its walls. Civilians went about their routines, soldiers continued training, and the Americans maintained their disciplined parade routines. But in the shadows, betrayal whispered, and Beckett realized that winning the war would require more than bravery in the field. It would demand vigilance, cunning, and the courage to uncover truths that some wished would remain hidden. As he prepared his next report for Churchill, Beckett felt the weight of responsibility settle heavy on his shoulders. The stakes had never been higher, and the enemy was no longer only Rommel or Hitler, it was also the traitor among them, working quietly to undo everything they were fighting for. The desert air was dry and sharp, carrying the heat of the sun and the distant echo of artillery fire. For Thomas Beckett, the planning table in London had felt like a battlefield in its own right, but nothing compared to seeing troops move in real time. This was the first joint operation between British and American forces, a coastal raid intended to disrupt German supply lines in North Africa. The stakes were enormous, and every decision carried consequences far beyond the desert sands. Montgomery oversaw the operation with calm precision, pointing to key positions and explaining the flow of movement. Patton, ever eager, leaned over maps with bright eyes, his enthusiasm tempered by a growing respect for the harsh realities of desert warfare. Eisenhower and Bradley coordinated logistics, ensuring that American and British units could work together despite differences in training, communication, and experience. Beckett followed the plan closely, noting the potential weak points and preparing contingencies in his mind. The operation began at first light. Dust rose in clouds as armored vehicles rumbled forward, and soldiers moved through the dunes with tense anticipation. The Americans, still learning the rhythms of British tactics, sometimes faltered, their timing off by seconds that mattered in war. Beckett's stomach knotted with every hesitation, every misstep, knowing how close disaster could be. Suddenly, a convoy veered off its intended path, exposing a flank to enemy fire. Machine guns erupted, and the desert shook with explosions. Chaos threatened to unravel the carefully laid plan. But Montgomery's quick thinking, paired with Patton's bold maneuvering, turned the tide. The Americans adapted, their raw energy meeting the discipline of seasoned British troops. Beckett watched as soldiers risked their lives to rescue wounded comrades, the human cost of war visible in every movement. By the time the dust settled, the operation had succeeded, but barely. Supplies were disrupted, German forces forced to retreat, and the first real test of the Anglo-American alliance had passed. Yet Beckett knew the victory was fragile. Miscommunication, inexperience, or misplaced trust could have destroyed everything. Back in the temporary headquarters, Churchill received the report with measured satisfaction, noting both the triumph and the vulnerabilities exposed. Beckett, exhausted but alert, understood the lesson. War was as much about coordination and trust as it was about courage and firepower. And in this alliance, every soldier, every officer, and every decision mattered. The war was never just about strategies and battles. It was about people. Letters, often carried by tired couriers or waiting in dusty stacks on desks, were the lifeline connecting soldiers to home and officers to the human cost of every decision. Thomas Beckett spent hours reading them, each one a small window into fear, courage, longing, and hope. Some were triumphant, recounting a small victory in the field. Others were heavy with grief, telling of friends lost, towns burned, or families torn apart. In the war rooms, the mood was quieter than usual. Montgomery, reviewing reports from North Africa, paused to read a letter from one of his soldiers. The boy spoke of exhaustion, thirst, and the constant fear of Rommel's tanks, but also of pride in fighting alongside his allies. Beckett noticed a flicker of empathy cross Montgomery's face, a rare glimpse of the man behind the uniform. Eisenhower and Bradley exchanged letters from home, both sharing glimpses of their lives outside the chaos, a reminder that the war touched even the most powerful. Patton, ever bold, skimmed through his letters with a smirk, but even he couldn't hide the tension behind his eyes. Every line of text reminded them that the stakes were real. People's lives were on the line, not just in battle, but in the decisions made far from the front. Beckett unfolded a letter from a British soldier who had been fighting in the desert with the Americans for the first time. The words painted a vivid picture: camaraderie forged in the heat of fire, trust built under pressure, and a quiet admiration for the bravery of allies untested in such brutal conditions. But hidden among the lines was unease, a suspicion that not all of the war's shadows had been uncovered. A sudden note from headquarters arrived, carrying intelligence that suggested a betrayal had reached the front lines. Beckett's stomach tightened. The war wasn't just about strategy, it was about vigilance, about noticing the subtle hints that could prevent disaster. Every letter, every message, could hold clues to danger or hope, and ignoring them could be fatal. As Beckett carefully filed the correspondence, he realized that these letters were more than communication. They were reminders of what was at stake, and why every action, every choice, and every alliance mattered. The human side of war was never far from the surface, and in those quiet moments between battles, the true weight of duty pressed down on every officer and soldier alike. The sun rose over London, casting golden light on streets still lined with rubble, yet alive with movement. Soldiers from both Britain and America prepared for another day of drills, inspections, and briefings, their boots echoing against the cobblestones. Thomas Beckett stood at the edge of the square, notebook in hand, watching the disciplined formations. Today wasn't just another parade, it was a statement. The Allies were united, visible, and ready. Churchill appeared on the balcony above, cigar in hand, surveying the scene with a critical yet measured gaze. His mind ran through every detail: logistics, morale, and the fragile alliance he had worked so hard to build. Montgomery and Patton walked among the ranks, exchanging nods and giving subtle corrections, ensuring that both armies moved as one. Eisenhower and Bradley coordinated silently, the ease of their collaboration a sign that the lessons of the past weeks had been learned. Beckett felt a sense of cautious optimism. This was a moment of unity, hard-won and fragile. The streets hummed with energy. Civilians leaned from windows, waving, smiling, and cheering, a mix of relief and curiosity etched on their faces. Children ran alongside the formations, dodging between boots and wagging small flags. For a moment, it felt as though the city itself was alive with hope, breathing with the promise that these soldiers brought. Yet Beckett knew the truth. The war was far from over. Behind the scenes, hidden dangers, enemy maneuvers, and political tensions continued to simmer. As the troops moved in perfect cadence, a sudden disturbance rippled through the square. A minor miscommunication between an American and a British officer caused a brief hesitation in the formation. Beckett felt his stomach tighten. Small mistakes could spiral into disaster, but the soldiers corrected themselves quickly. Churchill's eyes, sharp and calculating, softened ever so slightly. He saw not perfection, but determination and adaptability, and he knew that character often mattered more than flawless execution. In that fleeting moment, Beckett understood the scale of what they were witnessing. This was more than a parade. It was the forging of trust, courage, and cooperation under immense pressure. Every officer, every soldier, every civilian watching had a role in shaping the war's outcome. And while Rommel, Hitler, and the Axis powers still threatened on distant fronts, London streets had become a symbol of hope, resilience, and the unbreakable human spirit. As the sun dipped lower, shadows stretching across the cobblestones, Beckett felt a deep, steady resolve. The Alliance had survived tests of strategy, loyalty, and human error. Together, they had taken the first steps toward victory. And yet, the war continued. A battle not only of weapons, but of trust, courage, and the quiet determination of those willing to march toward destiny. If you want more WW2 stories like this, filled with hidden moments and untold perspectives, subscribe so you never miss the next chapter of history.